Hello, everyone, and well, it's an interesting opportunity to come here from Copenhagen and share a few ideas about, well, basically building on some of the things we already heard. Knowing that a lot of you, how many of you work in the private sector, work in private firms? Right. So the conversations we've had also yesterday made me think that there's this excellent quote by Graham Allison. Graham Allison is a political scientist, and he did one of the first analysis of political decision-making where he looked at what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis and what was the decision-making going on in the White House. And he's famous in political science circles for a quote, which is that government and private firms are the same in every way that doesn't matter. And in every single way that matters, actually government or public services are different than what we do in the private sector. So that might mean that taking what we know from business and putting it into government institutions is a bit of a challenge. So we've had a lot of interesting sort of images around sort of what are the challenges we're seeing, and here's another proposal for an image of a perfect storm and the kind of environment in which public managers and policymakers are trying to make decisions and trying to work with the world we're facing. So changing demography, we've heard about the Anthropocene and how we're changing the face of the planet. We also have a fiscal crisis, which means the government is not getting much more money at all in the future, and not in this country, but also not across Europe. So we're strapped for resources. We're seeing lots of technological change, some of the things that many of you are working on. But how can government tap into that? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could give every single child in public schools an iPad or a tablet to work on, but can we afford that? Wouldn't it be wonderful to give our patients in hospitals the very best treatment, newest technology, but can we afford that as a country, as a nation? And dealing with all those type of wicked, complex problems, this is the way we deal with them. In the public sector, we sit in our offices, in our silos, and we write memos, we write text. We do it on our own. We do it from our different professions, whether it's law, economics, or political science. And that's clearly, obviously, not working. So you probably all of you know this quote, but to me, being a political scientist, it's interesting because basically what Charles Eames is saying here is that design can probably help. And design, of course, is ultimately a discipline and a profession that is concerned with problem solving. And given the amount of problems that governments are facing, then maybe we should look to design, and maybe we should even look to designers for some kind of help. So to give an example from my organization's Minelab's work in Denmark, we're the Danish government's innovation team. Could be, how do you redesign a public school system? And so Denmark is a bit smaller than New York City. We have 5 million inhabitants. That translates into about 500,000 children in the Danish public school system. And on August 1st, we just launched the biggest reform of the school system in a generation. Part of the reason for the reform is that by every metric, pretty much, our school system is not performing as well as it should, even though we are the country in the world pretty much that spends the most money per child in public schools. And when we this summer had a policy debate, a public debate about this, I was moderating a conversation with different policymakers and the media around this reform. I was, being inspired by design, saying, well, actually, you know what? By August 1st, when we're launching this new reform, it's an experiment. It's a prototype. We've never done it before. We've never done this reform in 2014 with 500,000 children in this country in this time. It may have been well designed. It may have been well thought out. We've used all the expertise we have, but actually we've never done it before. It's an experiment, isn't it? And the bureaucrats, the civil servants that I was going to have this session with, amongst others, and they were organizing it, they said to me, yes, Christian, we know, it's an experiment. We know that, but you can't say that. How do you think the media would react if the minister goes out and says, so we're now exposing, we talked about lab rats earlier, we're exposing 500,000 children to one major big experiment. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. At least we'll learn something, right? So public policy, of course, is experiments, and usually what we're doing is we're prototyping and experimenting with the entire population. Over from Denmark, I was following what happened when the president here in the United States tried to launch a healthcare reform. That looked very much like a prototype to me, and a learning experience. For example, the digital platform for it. So how can you work intelligently at small scale designing reforms? Here's an image from some work we did at Minelab to design one component of the Danish school reform, which is a digital learning platform for how can teachers take basically what would be Common Core or achievement standards and work with them in practice in the classroom, and what would be the digital enablers of that. And these are design artifacts that were created by one of our designers in the team based on ethnography and on-site observation and interviews with kids and teachers and principals and local government officials to understand what's the context in which such a system could work, such a digital system could work. And what we're doing is basically co-designing the brief, the design brief for the digital platform, and the people you see in the image are both teachers but also policymakers. And our role at Minelab is basically to orchestrate and facilitate that conversation about what would be the components of the different elements and functions and systems that would be needed. So what we do at Minelab is, I'm a public servant. I'm part of the Danish, I work for the Danish government. But we are a design-based, basically a design studio that works to create better outcomes, which could be, for example, more learning for kids, or it could be health, it could be social issues, and so on, together with our stakeholders. And our stakeholders today are a number of departments and ministries that have chosen to embrace innovation and design more explicitly and invest in this kind of capability. So you can see that from the bicycles, we're in Copenhagen now. It's the Ministry of Business with the door there. On top right, on top left, it's the Ministry of Employment. It's the Ministry of Education with the red post box. And it's also a national, well, it's a city government as well, City of Odense, which is the place with the green grass there. Basically, we work with both national and local government to find ways of redesigning policy that makes sense at both national but also local level. So what Minelab is basically offering as an institutional part of government is a different set of skills, a different set of processes for working with policymaking and working with service design. So our team has backgrounds in anthropology, ethnography, design, and also in political science. And our role is really not to get any better ideas than our colleagues across the government system, but it is to facilitate or orchestrate processes that help civil servants get better ideas about what should they do. So we're working on the inside of the system, so to speak, to really leverage design for innovation. And we're not the only ones. As we heard earlier, the example also Jake gave is that across the world, really everywhere I'm looking, government organizations, institutions are beginning to embrace new ways of working with policy, working with services, and understanding that they do have to systematically experiment, not at full scale, but experiment in smaller scale through workshops, through new forms of citizen collaboration, new ways of crowdsourcing ideas, and basically beginning to form a whole new language, a whole new way of working with innovation in government that is not driven primarily by law or economics or whatever, but is driven by collaboration. So this is not a very pretty map, and it's actually already outdated. Two of the organizations on the map don't even exist anymore. It's only 1 year old, this map, made by the Parsons School here in New York. But if you look at the landscape of innovation teams or innovation labs in government, it's really changing rapidly. And this is just to give you an example of some of the things. And in the United States as well, a lot of city governments, as you probably know, are actually building innovation teams or design teams to work with policy and service change. So what I want to talk a little bit about is that what everybody is looking for in the public sector is really a new business model for government. We heard a lot about it already, a different constitution, different institutions. So I'll try to give my take on what is it that model looks like, and maybe zooming a little bit more in on how do we want our government organizations to function? What are the organizational principles that we're trying to explore here? What might that look like? So just very briefly to say that what we're looking at is that we really find that government needs to co-produce outcomes together with people, not deliver services to them. And that's a paradigm shift in how we think about government. We often talk about service delivery, but of course, as all of you know, is that service is never a delivery. It's an interaction. It's a relationship. But most of the authorities and institutions we've built they're not designed to recognize that. They're designed for mass production of services rather than for building longer-term relations. So these are some of the key words we're seeing being discussed, both in academic circles, but certainly also more and more operationally, that these are the shifts we need to make. To not deliver, but to activate citizens' resources and empower people from not just making transactions with millions of citizens or paying out pensions or paying out Social Security, but we're looking at what are the relations we're building, for example, across a school system. And how do we look at quality not as defined by public professionals like nurses, doctors, teachers, but what would it mean if it was citizens, it was patients, it was students that define what is quality for me? And again, how do we maybe also shift, and this is also probably even more challenging in the United States, shift from a legally based understanding of people's rights to certain services or rights to certain transactions to a right to an outcome, a right to a good life, a right to thrive, a right to learn, and looking at outcomes rather than at legislation or looking at activities. So this is the model that's inside the head of most public servants. This is and probably also most politicians, that we are authorities or we are policymakers and we make things happen. We push things into the world and they make some kind of difference to citizens. But the model that all of us exploring right now and that innovation teams and designers are helping with exploring looks something like this. To say, how is it that public authorities recognize that they're just one component of a system, one that can leverage some of these other resources, including citizens' own motivation and resources to create better outcomes. And this model, the challenge with this model, and this is where we need design, is basically that, we know that it might be real, but we don't know how to get there. So what are the things that designers might do? How is it that we can explore problem spaces? How is it we can generate scenarios? How is it that we can enact new futures that can help us get there? So let me just share with you these three major components. The big bubbles here are the design processes, and the smaller ones I've highlighted are ways in which public managers need to engage with design, need to work with designers, and the kind of attitudes we need from public managers and policymakers to leverage what design can really do. And this is a model that came out of some doctoral research I've been doing on how public managers across a number of countries, also in the United States, are experiencing what is it like to work with designers. So one example here could be an institution in Denmark for adult mentally and physically handicapped people who typically have a functional age of 1 or 2 years old. So these young people you see here, in terms of intellectual ability, they would be about like a 1-year-old or 2-year-old. And in this institution, the typical human relationship that these citizens have is with a paid professional. When they die, ultimately at their funerals, after staying in a place like this for their whole life, the people who come to the funeral are usually just paid professionals. So what would it be to redesign relations and relationships, and how would it be to inject hospitality and openness to a place like that kind of institution? So the design school in Kolding in Denmark did a project called Redesigning Relations. And there's even a website, also in English, around this Redesigning Relations program. And what they did was simply to redesign the processes and institutions so that volunteers locally, but also digitally on Facebook, could begin to connect with people here. And they saw a exponential growth in the relationships that these very, very, very vulnerable individuals could have. So how do you redesign for openness and for citizen engagement? When they looked at the institution first, there was not even any place that any visitor could sit, because they're just wheeling people around in wheelchairs, and there's just professionals and people. There's no one coming to visit. Another example is redesigning homelessness services, where in Lewisham in London, doing some design research, they trained frontline workers to video film their own interactions with citizens who are homeless. And one example was they realized when they were filming these interactions that they had a tendency to ask children of immigrant families, homeless immigrant families, to be translators, translate between English and their native language for their parents. So the videos they did showed that they were simply asking kids to be mediators between government and their families around the fact that their families were homeless. That was not supposed to happen. So whenever you use video and audio and other media to capture what's actually going on in the interactions between people, citizens, and government, you discover almost always something that's not working. And then you realize what you need to redesign. So the second major design activity that I'm finding is useful for policymakers is to generate better scenarios. This is a case in this image where nurses and doctors from the Danish National Hospital are looking at what would it be to create a meaningful patient experience. These are heart surgeons that fix people, and they do pacemakers, for example. But actually, the patient experience or the citizen experience of going through a healthcare process like that turned out to be not so good. And in this workshop, one of the things we did was to ask the following question, which is very, very disruptive to a hospital. What would happen if the patient's time was more important than the professional's time? How to redesign a hospital around optimizing patient time rather than the professionals. That was too crazy for them to really work on, so they agreed that, let's just say it's equally important. Maybe we can work with that. Another example is a project in a high school where we're asking a group of 9 teachers from different disciplines in this high school, so maths and science, but also humanities and social science, to collaborate around redesigning a curriculum. And after the process, which was a design-led process that we worked with them on, they said to the principal, weren't you trying to control us all the time? Weren't you deciding on the outcome? Didn't you have an idea about the result already when you asked us to do this work? And she said, no, I didn't. I really did not know where we were going. And that's why this is challenging public managers who are used to having control and authorization and commanding and so on, that design work actually is an open process where we don't know necessarily what the problem is, and we certainly don't know what the solutions will be. And she says, and she's really, this is a design thinking school principal here, who says, it was a positive thing for me to lose control of the process because that empowered my staff to actually find solutions. Final example, enacting new practices, is a project where we were prototyping new approaches to compliance and control of business, small business in Denmark, in this case, restaurants and food service businesses. And you can see the folder, the pamphlet in the picture has no text on it. It just has the logos of 3 agencies. And what we're doing is, of course, is prototyping. What would it take to inform these businesses, and how can we co-design government information and government regulation and government interventions together with business owners? And what would be the digital platform? What would be the forms and so on? So how do we invite businesses in to be co-designers of government interventions rather than just recipients of it? And finally, a final case from the hospital example where we worked with the heart surgeons and the nurses there. Again, here the manager, the head nurse, actually turns out to be inspired by design work and says, well, actually, why don't I start prototyping? I can also, why don't I start looking at how can we optimize patients' experience? What would be a tool for patients to work with a meaningful process and document and have a journal or something like that? And so she actually, as a nurse, started sketching and became really a designer in the process. So doing this kind of work placed inside the public sector, inside government, is not always so easy. And I would say that if it feels easy, then we're probably not trying hard enough. So just a couple of tips on what this takes before I conclude. What does it take to do this kind of work, and what would it take if any of you were to go into the public sector, maybe here in the United States, and try to do some of this work? Well, first of all, I think it takes patience. And I know that not all designers are so patient with bureaucracy and organizations and decision-making and that kind of stuff. And that's also what I experienced from the designers on my team, that sometimes, things take time. But the legitimacy we have at Minelab is we stay in the organization, we stay in the process. And those of you who work on internal design functions will recognize this, that we can be there for the long term and follow through on whether things actually turn out as intended and create the change we look for. So that's one thing, patience. Another one is empathy. And here, it's always easy, or not easy, but I suppose it's part of designer's professionalism to have empathy with users, with end users, in this case with citizens, for example. But you also have to empathize with the system you're part of. How do you empathize with bureaucrats, with public managers, with politicians, understand their constraints and their opportunities, and how do you, as you work loyally as a mediator between the outside world of citizens and the world out there, but also the inside world, which is just as complex in many ways, of public bureaucracy. And finally, ambition, and I think this probably would go down with a lot lot of designers, that we have to be passionate about wanting to make that difference. The energy and the motivation for my team, we've done this work with my team for about 8 years now. None of them have left in 8 years, even though they could probably get better paid jobs in the private sector. One of the reasons I think is because we really fundamentally believe in this and we want to make a difference. And that is also the kind of energy we bring to public servants who sometimes have, let's just call it, lost a little bit of faith. We can maybe inject some of that faith again. So for you to get involved, I would say that right now, the innovation teams are being built across the world and also across the United States. There's a new innovation team in Washington, D.C., in the federal government Office of Personnel Management. Not very public, but it's actually there. It exists. There's a design studio. I've seen it. I've been there. I even helped them kick off a couple of years ago. So the organizational structures are there to get into government and work on this stuff, on this really wicked but also very exciting stuff. And they really are going to need designers to help. There's a book you can check out on Design for Policy that's coming out here in December that will have both an overview of the labs and stuff going on, but also what does this actually mean. So check it out. And happy to listen to your questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Christian. That was fascinating. Maybe I'd start by just asking a question, and please send in your questions, that occurred to me as you were speaking, and it's occurred to me in a lot of discussions this morning. I think we're all very passionately committed to this idea of participation and inclusion. How do we make sure, as we step into this space, though, that what we get is not parochial, thoughtless, kind of, here's my priorities. As we said earlier this morning, I know what everyone needs based on what I've got. And instead get kind of informed, empathetic, because certainly we've all seen processes of inclusion go bad and produce worse results than processes that were less inclusive but more informed by data and empathy and things like that.
Well, so part of it is about this loss of control, right? That the reasons that processes of inclusion, when government initiates them, go wrong is that they're designed for the wrong reasons. They're designed for political legitimacy and to be able to check the box and say, well, we've included people, we've listened, and now we're doing the same thing as we intended all along. So how do you create honest, open, and trusted spaces for real inclusion, real co-design? And I think that to do so, we have to institutionalize. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're doing with iTeams and innovation labs around the world, is to say, well, let's make this a function of government and a profession of government, and then let's also challenge the ways in which we've done it so far. Because in many ways, that model is broken. Mm-hmm. The town hall meeting is broken. Maybe the election process is broken. Mm-hmm. We need new models.
So this is where the skills of designers as facilitators of the process and the existence of a pretty explicit process would seem to be really important.
That's very important, but it's also important to authorize those processes, right? So if, as a designer coming into public bureaucracy, you can offer a lot of activity or processes and methods and tools and design thinking and so on, but we have to authorize that it's okay. Because otherwise, it'll be a nice thing to do. We'll go on innovation holiday with a few designers. We'll come back and do what we did before. So you also have to get under the skin of the process, and you also have to make it stick. And that's also why. So when I say patience, for instance, it takes time to make these things stick, and make a dent, so to speak, within the fabric of bureaucracy.
That really relates to one of the questions that we got here, which is how. Can you tell us a little bit about the establishment of the Minelab? How you mentioned 8 years. What did that evolution look like?
Yeah, so I'm just writing on a blog for the Rockefeller Foundation. It'll come out, I think, in a week or two on the trajectory we've been through at Minelab. We started out actually 12 years ago, before my time, on doing workshops and just work on creativity and collaboration. Then 8 years ago, we started on doing human-centered design projects. And 2 or 3 years ago, we said, well, actually, just a human-centered design project within government actually does not make much of a dent either. What we have to work on is systems change, and much more fundamental change. Now we call it change programs or change agendas. Mm-hmm. And to the question that's posed here is, Well, the way in which we select our work is to look at what's top of mind for the Danish government, for our ministers. What is democracy asking? What are ministers promising citizens? Mm-hmm. And then those are the agendas we go into. So, for example, school reform, or entitlement reform on employment system, or Denmark's future as an advanced manufacturing nation, which we're looking at right now. And we're saying there's a promise here, but how do we make that happen? So that's how we prioritize, and we do it together then with the top civil servants that sit on my board. Mm.
You know, one gets a sense of the U.S. as being behind here. Maybe we're just being paranoid, but it seems like every time I go to Europe, there's so much going on there. So impressive, your efforts. We hear about what's going on in Singapore. As a completely unbiased observer, what would you say about our progress here in the U.S. and who do we have to learn from? And now we know you're getting on a plane again right away, so you're safe. We'll give you an escort.
Well, actually, I'm actually going to Chicago, so I'm not that safe.
Oh, okay. All right.
Actually, I'm going to continue this conversation with some other people also tomorrow. So I'm actually a dual citizen, both of Denmark and the United States, and so I empathize a lot with the U.S. My dad's from the U.S. originally, and so I follow what's going on here. I also visit quite a lot. This is, I think, my 5th visit to New York in this year. I don't think you're that far behind. I think there's a lot of momentum happening at city level. I was with the former Mayor Bloomberg at City Lab in LA just a month ago, and there's a massive momentum at city level. Lots of things happening around, of course, around technology, around data and analytics and that stuff. The conversation we had this morning that I listened into on some of the more political and institutional dysfunctionalities in Washington and so on, you're kind of behind on some of that. But Europe has its problems too. I mean, just look at the European elections and know what's going on with radicalism and so on as well. So I would say where you may want to push more is to take government seriously, take public institutions seriously, to invest in them, to be proud of them, and to rebuild them. Because when you look at Europe, at least in the Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, where I did grow up, we actually find government to be part of the solution. And that's the public debate we have. The public debate is never to get rid of government. That's not just a discussion. The public debate is how can we make government work better, because we need it. And in the United States, sometimes it feels as if you kind of say, well, let's just do without government or whatever. And I think you need to change that conversation. And designers can play a big role, because when the government begins to demonstrate and show it can work, then you build trust, and then you build confidence, and then you begin to say, well, government actually is part of the solution. Yeah.
And I think your advice to look to the local level is such an opportunity for all of us. I know some of the most satisfying work I've done in design thinking has been a project we did with the Cincinnati Public Schools. Yeah. And you get into the schools working with the middle school principals, and you look at the courage and the creativity of these individuals working with the level of resources they've got, while we complain in business organizations with the level of resources we've got. And you look at their receptivity and the effect that design thinking processes can have. Yes. It's really so motivating. Yeah.
And I think for this momentum and this agenda to really lift in the United States, you've got to start with the concrete. You've got to start at I think, at local and city level, and you've got to demonstrate how this can make a difference to the kids, to patients, and to citizens. And then you can take it all the way up to the top level and say, listen, how do we then enable that? How do we empower people to do that bottom up? So it's both a top-down and a bottom-up conversation, but to make it tangible and understandable and meaningful to politicians and to senior decision makers also in Washington, I think you need to demonstrate the power of this at a very tangible, granular level locally. Yeah.
Well, this has been terrific. Thank you for helping us take what seems like an awfully big, messy problem and figuring out ways that we can all make a difference.
You're welcome.
Forward. Great. Thank you for being here.